Ladies and gentlemen, it is pretty fair to say that there's been a lot of discussion about Brant lately, and really, frankly, none of it on his weapon. And Kuro has come out with some very fantastic news. Full details on Unflickering Valor, how it's going to work, the benefits that it's going to provide to Brant and potentially other sword users on the roster. And news on this weapon is especially important for one very simple reason. And that is Brant's Forte Circuit. The Forte Circuit, which has garnered so much attention across the community due to the fact that for Brant to maximize its bonuses, he's going to need about 280% ER. Something that, honestly, can't really be achieved at all without a signature weapon that provides ER. And thankfully, we finally got some news on how his signature is going to work and what its effects are going to be, and how it's going to weave into his overall gameplay. So with that, let's go ahead, let's get right on into it. So, Unflickering Valor is going to be over here, and with good news, everybody. We've got some very good news. It's going to be covered in purple flame, and it's going to have an energy regen main stat of 77%, alongside a very low base attack of 412. And so there's going to be some really important things to keep in mind when it comes to this stat portfolio, because it is one of the most unique that we have in the game. It is a stat profile that we've only seen on Shorekeeper's weapon in the past. And considering that Brant is an attack-focused sub DPS hybrid main DPS character, you can play a main DPS if you want, there's going to be some important things to keep in mind when it comes to his building, his echoes, and particularly some of his substats as you move forward if this is the weapon that you're going with. So with that, keep in mind that Brant's base attack is going to be very low with this weapon. And this is the reason why. With a base attack of 412, which was used to balance out his energy regen of 77%, this weapon is going to be, in a lot of ways, weaker than the other 5 stars in the game. Options like Red Spring will have a base attack of like 587. And believe me when I say 587 for a stat like base attack is very high. And the reason for that is pretty simple. When it comes to things like echoes, specifically something like maybe your attack 1 cost, which will give you a percentage boost to attack, or even a substat that gives you attack percentage, these will work off of your base stats. And so when it comes to a character like Brant, he's not going to get as much benefit from percentage attack boosts on your team. It turns out that a stat bonus like basic attack damage is way more effective for his overall damage portfolio. Second, flat attack is also better on Brant than it is on other characters, because those percentage attack boosts, again, aren't having as much of an impact because the base attack is noticeably lower. And the third element, and the third component, is actually a bit more nuanced. And that third element is going to be, well, buffs from your team. We all know that Rejuvenating Glow gives 15% attack to every character on your team. And characters like Verena, for example, will give a 20% attack boost to the team. And these percentage buffs will also be lower on Brant if he's using a signature. So keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen. S2 Shorekeeper as well, that 40% attack boost. So definitely things that you have to watch out for across his Echo building. He's not going to be getting as many benefits as other characters simply due to this weapon. However, there are some very big upsides, and we're about to get into them in a second. We've covered everything that his base stats do. We talked about how important ER is going to be for his actual echoes and reaching that 280% or potentially lower, like 250 or 260. Let's get into the actual weapon effect now. When it comes to his weapon skill, which is one of the other important reasons why you might be pulling a weapon, Brant's weapon skill is pretty crazy. It's going to increase his critical rate by 8%, which is about 1 whole substat. Not too much, but also a nice bonus as well. And casting a Resonance Liberation is going to give him a 24% basic attack damage bonus for 10 seconds. And then dealing basic attack damage is also going to give him a basic attack damage bonus for 4 seconds. So the total buff is going to be 48% basic attack for 10 seconds at maximum, with another 24% from simply dealing basic attack damage repeatedly able to be stacked across his rotation. And so when it comes to how Brant actually works, it's pretty simple. Here is what a sample rotation for Brant is going to look like. You're going to intro skill onto him. You're going to cast your Liberation at the start of the rotation. You're going to activate that 10-second buff. And then you're just going to repeatedly basic attack, right? Until his Forte circuit is full, and you're going to use Return from the Ashes. And as you noticed, that is a pretty fast, a pretty concise rotation that's going to get him up and running and ready to swap to another character almost as soon as possible. And so when it comes to the rather short duration that you're going to be seeing for his full buffs, it's not that big of a deal if you are playing him in the sub DPS role. But it will be fair to notice, right, as a whole, this weapon is a little bit weaker than other options. Specifically, let's just look at Zhang Liao's weapon, for example. This weapon just straight up gives a 12% attribute damage bonus and then gives you a 48% resonance liberation damage bonus that can be extended basically up until like 20 plus seconds. This is clearly for a main DPS character, right? And Brant's more so geared as a sub DPS with less field time. And so while as a whole, it looks like this is a weaker weapon, it should work out just fine for his typical playstyle. The only issue that some Brant players are going to find is the fact that if they are trying to play him as a main DPS, right? He's basic attack damage focused clearly, and they are trying to play him as like a main DPS with a character like Sanhua, whose outro skill buff lasts 14 seconds, you might run into some issues. You might run into some really big issues trying to make him work, because this buff admittedly will time out kind of quickly. So keep that in mind if you are pulling this weapon for him. It does have a bit of a condensed uptime relative to other characters. One thing in particular that you need to keep in mind when it comes to this weapon synergy with Brant is just how good basic attack damage bonus is for this character. While other characters kind of benefit a lot from maybe flat attack or attack percentage boosts, Brant gets so much more benefit from having these percentage damage bonuses. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Brant's Forte gives him additional attack, flat attack, not base attack, flat attack, just from having ER. And it's a lot. 1560 at a baseline. And then when he casts his Liberation, that flat attack goes all the way up to 2600. 2600 attack is just being added on top of all of his other damage bonuses. And it's not impacted at all by his other stats. And what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that all of these stat bonuses to basic attack damage, which is kind of the only damage type he really deals meaningful damage of, those will have a massive effect on that flat attack that's getting added to his rotations and his damage output. And that's what makes this weapon in particular one that gives those stats so incredibly strong on him. So this is, again, one of the big reasons for why his signature is going to be his top choice, and percent like way higher than other options at a baseline. And so now we talked about Brant's weapon. We talked about how it's going to work with this kit. We showed off a sample rotation, which is very smooth and very fast. It shouldn't have problems for his normal sub DPS gameplay, but it has some problems with the main DPS gameplay. Let's talk about some of the other options that Brant might be able to use. And so the clear-cut other option is going to be Overture for a character like Brant. The only issue with this weapon is that it has a much lower base attack than even Brant's, and so attack percentage buffs are even going to be weaker, and it doesn't give as much ER. So there's going to need to be a lot of investment on your Echo substats to actually get him functioning. Let's just say I put on my Brant set, and then I also put on a fully leveled variation, which is going to have the full stats of Overture. In this situation, I have an ER roll on almost every single piece, and I'm only going to be at 260%. It's almost impossible without perfect rolls on every single piece. We're just seeing ER over here, ER over here. I'm actually missing an ER roll over here, so maybe I'll be able to hit 270, but then ER over here, and then ER over here. If I get 5 ER rolls on the character, I would have about 270% ER, which is okay, right? It's fine. It'll get me all the damage bonuses I need. 260 is going to be fine as well, and 250 is also probably going to work. But you're going to need a lot of ER rolls relatively, at least a minimum of 3, if you're trying to get the full sets bonuses working and all of that stuff going. It should be fine in normal gameplay, but of course, Brant's going to do a lot better on his signature. The last option that some people might have is just running the fusion set, right? Just running a set like Molten Rift, and then going ahead and using Emerald to Genesis instead. There are some people running calculations on this combo, simply just using the higher base attack and more attack subs doing that whole setup. We're not necessarily sure how good that's going to be. You might actually have some massive ER problems just getting his liberation up because he has high ER needs for a reason. And so that rotation, that smoothness still has to be seen because yes, he'll have his liberation for the first rotation, but if you're not specializing in ER for his kit, then you might not have his liberation up for future ones. So if Emerald of Genesis is what you're thinking of using, if this weapon is what you're thinking of using with Brant along with Fusion Echoes, kind of like sharing the same build as this Chang Li over here, you're welcome to try it, but I do think you could potentially run into some issues. That's still something we need to test, so I wouldn't fully commit to this build unless you have some more data and some actual findings. The last thing that we're going to be talking about when it comes to Brant and when it comes to his weapon is, well, who can actually use this? Who else on the roster is going to make use of 412 base attack, 77% ER, and then a weapon skill, right? That's going to focus on giving a little bit of crit rate and basic attack damage. When it comes to the sword wielders on the roster who like this weapon, nobody really likes this weapon. You might think, just from the weapon skill, you're going to have some users like maybe Havoc Rover. You're going to have some users like Camellia, who do a decent amount of basic attack damage. But in reality, ladies and gentlemen, this is what's going to occur if you use this weapon on anybody like Havoc Rover or Camellia. Their damage will fall off of a fucking cliff. And the reason why their damage is going to fall off of a fucking cliff is because the base attack will be 400. This is the lowest base attack 5-star weapon in the game. It shares that title with Shorekeeper. When the base attack of a weapon like Emerald of Genesis or Red Spring is 587, you are functionally losing around 170 base attack. You will also be losing a massive amount of crit rate that those weapons provide, because Emerald of Genesis, ladies and gentlemen, provides 24.3% crit rate as its main stat. This gives 8. It literally gives 1/3 of that bonus. The same exact crit stats for Red Spring as well, 24.3. And when this gives 8, your build is essentially being forced into also using a crit rate forecast. When you're running a weapon like Emerald of Genesis or Red Spring, you typically use a crit damage forecast. And that's a big way for the actual characters like Camellia or Havoc Rover to actually deal damage in the first place. And if they don't have that ready to go, if they don't have those bonuses, oh, they're really going to have a rough time. They're really, really going to have a rough time. And even with this weapon skill giving 48% total basic attack damage, guys, this weapon skill gives you 30% just for existing, and then additional 40% when Camellia goes into her budding form. That basically goes all the way up to 70% across her rotation. Camellia's weapon has higher base stats, more crit rate, more attack bonus as like a secondary line, and then a higher basic attack damage bonus. The only thing Camellia's weapon doesn't give is ER. And so you might be thinking that this 77% ER is going to be helpful. It's too much. It's literally too much. No sword user in the game actually wants more than 120 or 130 ER. Camellia and Havoc Rover specifically do not really want more than 130. And Camellia definitely doesn't want more than 120. And so 77% at a baseline is 1,000,000% overkill. It is wasted stats. It is a power budget of the weapon that has no use on any other wielder except for Brant. And what this means, ladies and gentlemen, is that as a whole, Brant's weapon is one of the most tailored in the game, where pretty much every other option, even 4-star options, are going to be better on main DPS characters than Brant's weapon. It is 1,000,000% one of the most tailored signatures, and in all honesty, you should not pull this unless you are pulling it specifically for Brant. And if you're thinking about using this on other characters, you are going to be heavily surprised at just how bad it is, especially knowing that there is a free-to-play option like Emerald of Genesis just in the game that will be better on every other sword user than Brant's signature will be. Emerald of Genesis will be better on every single character compared to Brant's sig. And it's a bit of an issue. It's a bit of a problem. It's a bit of a doozy. If I were to rank Brant's weapon on a tier list for how widely usable it is on other characters, it would probably be at the bottom because of its main stats. And so there is one shining light when it comes to Brant's kit, and Brant specifically when it comes to this weapon. And it's the fact that Brant can actually run a fusion damage 3 cost if this weapon is being used. because its ER is so high at 77%. If you have a fusion damage 3 cost and then 4 to 5 ER subs across your echoes, then you will be able to reach 250 plus and potentially deal more damage than just with 2 ER pieces. And so this does let you hyper optimize your Brant and his echoes and reach the highest potential for his damage. But you're going to have to work for it on the echo rolling side. And of course, you have to keep in mind that this weapon is not really going to be usable on anybody else. And so we've covered all of the specifics, all of the nuances when it comes to Unflickering Valor. Now let's just do a little bit of cleanup, a little bit of janitorial work, and talk about its upgrade materials. Nothing too crazy here, ladies and gentlemen. It's just going to be using your Howler cores, which are a drop from version 1.0. I'm kind of surprised that the devs are still using 1.0 mats versus the 2.0 weapons. I think it's fair to say that we could, in all honesty, I do think that we could start using some of these other mats. Like the Tidal Residuum, the Polygon cores, you know, the drops that we get from monsters in Renacida. I would say we could start using some of those because a lot of people are, I mean, let's be real here, they're starting to run out of the 1.0 mats because they're only playing in the 2.0 map. And I think it's been long enough at this point. Right? I think it's been long enough and we can start using more of these. But that's just a personal take from my end. Of course, Kuro still has all of these materials, these enclosure tanks that they're like spamming in every single event, and you can just redeem them for any mob map. So that's just there. No big deal, but just something I wanted to point out because this is the 4th character in 2.0 that's using 1.0 mats for their weapon. And of course, they're just going to be using the same exact sword mats to get upgraded as well. Nothing too crazy here. So with that, that's going to be covering our review of Brant's weapon. I would say it is kind of close to a must pull if you're trying to optimize his character, his damage, and his kit. But you have to keep in mind that it's not really that good on anybody else. And if you're trying to use it on anybody else, you're going to be severely disappointed when you find out that Emerald of Genesis is just flat out better in almost every single way. So it's only for him. Don't pull it for anybody else, but it is exceptionally good for him. So with that, let me know what you all think, and peace.